The genes you were born with are like a recipe book. Genes are like a recipe. Or a blueprint, doesn't matter. Everybody get it? Now, this is what really I think is amazing. If you can imagine, I used to say the Twin Towers, but since 9/11, I just don't think it's appropriate. So let's imagine there's 2 Empire State Buildings. And if you can imagine that those 2 Empire State Buildings were filled from the bottom floor, every floor was chock full of books. From the bottom floor all the way up to the top. And there's 2 Empire State Buildings full of books. That's your DNA. That's the amount of information. Every single line on every page of that book represented some kind of recipe for some kind of enzyme or hormone or state of physiology to match what? What does the blueprint of our genes consist of? It consists of the environmental stimuli of our ancestors. It's the environmental stimuli of our ancestors that shaped our genes, yes or yes? Our genes didn't become the way they are by random chance. Our genes became the way they are by what? Random chance, then selected based on what? Survivability in that environment. Understand? So it's really the environment that determines evolution, isn't it? Because what does evolution mean? More suitable to the environment you're in. Everybody get it? So if you can now imagine all those books with all those pages, with all those lines and all those letters, they'd all just be 4 letters, A, G, C, U, but it doesn't matter. But if you could imagine all that, and that's your DNA, that's your recipe for life. Everybody get it? So here's what's interesting, is that the interesting thing about a blueprint or the recipe book, and if you can imagine those are all recipe books, what you have to really understand is what recipe gets taken to the kitchen to get cooked up has nothing to do with the genes or the books. The books, the recipe books in your kitchen don't determine what you cook up in the kitchen. They're passive. They're just simply passive sources of information that somebody has to read. And what determines what page you read? What determines what recipe will get cooked up in the kitchen of your cell? What determines what blueprint will be photocopied and taken into the manufacturing plant of your cell? Is it the genes themselves that determine that? Is it random chance? Or is it some kind of signal that determines which part of that DNA will be copied and taken into the cytoplasm or the manufacturing plant? It's a signal. This is what we've learned in the last 10 years. We've learned that we used to think that it was the recipe book that determined the quality and quantity of our lives. Now what we're realizing, especially after the Human Genome Project, which only found 25,000 genes, we have most of them are the same as a worm. I think we have like 98% similar to a worm, 98.2 with a chimp or something. In fact, I think the worm has more genes than we do. Really. Anyway, numbers don't matter. Now, if you can imagine, it's hard for me to sit down when I speak, but they're trying to film this. If you can imagine, now here's what happens. That signal from your environment, has to be taken in somehow to change your physiology. So in other words, if it gets cold, does your physiology change? Yeah? If you start to exercise, if in other words you start to try to lift an external load, will your physiology change? Will your heart rate change and your blood pressure change? Yes, will you send more blood to the skeletal muscle and less away from your digestive stuff? Yes. If I put you at altitude, will your physiology change? Here's how that works. You have a signal from your environment, which your nervous system picks up, and that signal is sent to your cell membrane. That signal has to go through your cell membrane to the nucleus, and then when it gets inside that nucleus, all of a sudden now it walks into that Empire State Building, and it's got all the Empire State Building all the way to the top, both Empire State Buildings, all full of books, all with pages full of hundreds of thousands of pages, filled with hundreds of thousands of lines, filled with those letters, and that signal has to be coded so it can go to the exact right page, first of all it has to go to the right building, to the right floor, to the right stacks, to the right book shelf, to the right book on that shelf, to the right page on that book, to the right line on the right page of that book. And it has to photocopy that. And then it has to take that down into the engine room, and you're going to make a protein or an enzyme. It's one of the most incredible, awe-inspiring things you'll ever imagine. But here's the ticket. Here's the big, most important part. Is that how that DNA, how your genes, what proteins they're going to transcribe, is based entirely on the signal that gets to that gene, not on the gene itself. And all of the things that determine whether or not you're going to express happiness or health or fitness or big muscles or being good at CrossFit or being good at paddling or being good at life or being a good parent, all of that depends on the stimulation that you provide for your cells. You have a blueprint that sets out from birth what is required for you to express your potential. Your genes determine your potential. Whether or not you reach that potential is entirely based on the environment that you live in and your lifestyle choices. That's epigenetics. Epigenetics says it's not the gene, it's which genes get expressed. One of the best ways for me to really drive that home and explain that to you is that for you to understand that every single cell in your body is genetically identical. Your liver cell has the exact same DNA as your heart cell. Your heart cell has the exact same DNA and gene code as your kidney cell, as your pancreatic cell, as your gonadal cells, as your hair cells. They all have the exact same DNA. And yet look how different their structure and function is. And in fact, if we look at stem cell research and we take, what's the stem cell? It's an undifferentiated cell. In other words, they all are genetically identical, and we can put them in little petri dishes. And if we take a stem cell, meaning it's a human cell that hasn't not yet become differentiated into a specific tissue, but it has the exact same DNA. So I take all these cells that are genetically identical, and I put them in different petri dishes. And if I take this cell and I put it in with heart tissue, what does it turn into? Heart tissue. And if I take the exact identical copy of that cell and I put it in with kidney tissue, what does it turn into? Right, so in the kidney, imagine how different that is. What if I put it in with red blood cells? Or in bone marrow cells, actually. It's going to produce red blood. Imagine how different, what kind of enzymes and hormones it can produce that's going to occur. And they're all genetically identical. So what do we know determines what a cell does? Not the code of the DNA. The code of the DNA determines what species you are. It determines who you can successfully mate with. It doesn't determine whether or not you're going to be a successful member of that species. Your DNA has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to be a successful member of the species. It just tells you which species you're going to be a part of. That was a long way of getting to this. Once we can understand this, that everything that we have to think about has to be species-wide and species-specific. If it doesn't fall into those categories and meet those two criteria, somebody's trying to rip you off or sell you something. Here's what I mean. Which giraffe needs to eat different foods than any other giraffe? Which one? No. Which zebra needs to have a different social environment than all the other zebras? I don't care, let's go with a gnu. Which gnu has to have different energy expenditure and exercise patterns to be healthy than the other gnus? In other words, is it fair to say that amongst all the species on Earth, if you're a member of that species, your requirements in terms of nutrition, exercise, social patterns, whatever they have, are identical to every other member of that species? Is that true? Yes, because every member of the species has the same genome. So it's your genome that determines what you should eat. It's your genome that determines what kind of energy and expenditure patterns that you require to express your potential. And it's your genome that determines what kind of socialization patterns and thought patterns, if you're human, that you require. You are not unique in terms of whether or not what kind of diet you should eat, what kind of exercise you require, or what kind of social patterns and self-esteem you require. Do you understand that? That everyone's going to try and teach you that you're unique, but in biology, it's the last thing we would teach. We would never teach that a giraffe eats something, that you have to take blood from a giraffe to see what kind of food it should eat. You would say to a sick giraffe in captivity, what? Hey, dummy, eat what the healthy giraffes are eating. Yes? Well, that's what I'm saying to humans all around the world. Hey, dummies. Why don't you just eat what your healthy ancestors ate? Why don't you start having movement patterns and exercise classes and everything else like your ancestors did? Why don't you start having communities and tribes and forming, relationships like your ancestors did, and then you can actually express happiness instead of walking around anxious and depressed and freaked out all the time. We need to we have to change our environment to match our genetic requirements as closely as possible. That's the secret to performance, and it's the secret to health.